I have spent 30 years studying Iranian influence operations in the Middle East, from Hezbollah in Lebanon through the Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthi insurgency in Yemen, and the IRGC Quds Force networks that operate across the region. I have sat in secure facilities where we mapped the Iranian command and control networks, where we identified the militia leaders, and where we assessed the threat that Iranian-backed forces pose to American personnel in Iraq, Syria, and the broader theater. Nothing in those 3 decades prepared me for what happened between 0230 and 0745 hours local time on December 14th, 2024. 1,500 Iranian-trained sleeper cell operatives embedded inside Iraqi security forces, inside nominally independent militia groups, and inside civilian populations surrounding American installations activated simultaneously in a coordinated operation that targeted 14 U.S. military compounds, diplomatic facilities, and contractor bases across Iraq. Not probed, not harassed, overrun. The American Embassy compound in Baghdad's Green Zone, Camp Victory, near Baghdad International Airport, Al-Assad Air Base in Anbar Province, and 11 smaller forward operating bases and diplomatic security outposts were assaulted by forces using Iraqi military uniforms, Iraqi security credentials, and operational intelligence that could only have come from penetration of Iraqi government institutions at the highest levels. U.S. Central Command has confirmed that between 340 and 410 American military personnel, diplomats, and contractors were killed in the initial assaults, with an additional 180 missing and presumed captured. And the State Department, in a classified cable that was leaked to the press within 18 hours, acknowledged that a large-scale evacuation of American personnel from Iraq is operationally impossible under current conditions. I want to be honest with you about something. I have reviewed every Iranian escalation against American interests in the region since the 1979 embassy takeover. I have studied the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, the Khobar Towers attack, the roadside bomb campaigns during the Iraq War, and the missile and drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities. What I did not anticipate was that Iran would execute a coordinated ground assault operation using forces that were pre-positioned inside Iraqi institutions and that were activated with the operational precision of a conventional military offensive. This was not terrorism. This was not militia harassment. This was a military operation executed by irregular forces operating under a unified command structure with objectives, timelines, and a level of coordination that demonstrated years of preparation. In the next 38 minutes, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that need answers. First, how did Iran embed 1,500 operatives inside Iraqi security forces and civilian populations without triggering American counterintelligence or Iraqi government detection, given that the United States has maintained intelligence collection operations in Iraq for more than 2 decades? Second, what specific operational capabilities and intelligence did these sleeper cells possess that allowed them to penetrate American compounds that were supposed to be defended by Iraqi security forces, by private security contractors, and by U.S. military personnel? Third, why did the Iraqi government, which is supposed to be a sovereign partner of the United States, either fail to prevent the operation or actively facilitate it? And what does that failure reveal about the true balance of power in Iraq? And fourth, what does this crisis mean for the viability of the American military presence in Iraq, for the broader U.S. strategy in the Middle East, and for the credibility of American assurances to allies and partners that depend on American protection? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not sanitize the operational disaster or accept the official explanations at face value, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like, drop your assessment in the comments. I read them. What I am about to walk you through is built from confirmed casualty reports, leaked State Department assessments, open source video documentation from the assaults, and analysis from intelligence professionals who have been tracking Iranian influence operations in Iraq for decades. Let me be precise about this. Phase 1 of the Iranian operation began at 0230 hours on December 14th. Sleeper cell operatives embedded inside the Iraqi Federal Police, inside the Iraqi Army's 9th Armored Division, and inside the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are nominally under Iraqi government control but are effectively Iranian proxies, initiated simultaneous assaults on American compounds across Baghdad, Anbar, Salah ad-Din, and Diyala provinces. The operatives were wearing Iraqi military and police uniforms. They were carrying Iraqi military identification, and they were operating vehicles with Iraqi government markings. The American security personnel at the compound gates, who had been trained to recognize and to cooperate with Iraqi security forces, allowed the assault teams to approach the perimeters before recognizing that the forces were hostile. The American embassy compound in Baghdad's Green Zone took the most sustained assault. The Green Zone is supposed to be the most secure location in Iraq. It is surrounded by multiple layers of Iraqi security checkpoints, blast walls, and monitored access points. At 0237 hours, a convoy of 6 Iraqi federal police vehicles approached the outer checkpoint of the embassy compound. The vehicles were waved through by the Iraqi checkpoint personnel who were either complicit in the operation or who were following orders from commanders who had been compromised by Iranian intelligence. The vehicles proceeded to the embassy's outer perimeter wall. The assault teams dismounted and used explosives to breach the wall at 3 points. The Regional Security Office, which is responsible for defending the embassy, responded with the Marine Security Guard detachment. The Marines engaged the assault teams with small arms fire, but the assault teams had suppressive fire support from heavy machine guns mounted on the vehicles, and they had numerical superiority. The initial breach was followed by a second wave of approximately 80 operatives who entered through the breached wall and moved toward the embassy chancery building. The fighting inside the compound lasted for more than 4 hours. The Marines and the diplomatic security agents fought a delaying action that allowed the majority of the embassy staff to move to the secure vault areas inside the chancery. But the compound's outer buildings, including the housing units and the administrative offices, were overrun. Camp Victory, located adjacent to Baghdad International Airport, took a similar assault. Camp Victory is a logistics and administrative hub that supports American military operations across Iraq. At 0242 hours, a battalion-sized element of the Iraqi Army's 9th Armored Division, which is based near the airport, approached the camp's main gate. The Iraqi battalion commander transmitted a message to the American camp commander stating that the battalion had been ordered to reinforce the camp's security in response to a heightened threat alert. The American commander, who had no independent confirmation of the threat alert, but who had been instructed to maintain cooperative relations with Iraqi forces, authorized the Iraqi battalion to enter the camp. Once inside, the Iraqi battalion dispersed across the camp and initiated attacks on the barracks, the fuel depot, the ammunition storage area, and the operations center. The American forces, which included a company of Army military police and a platoon of security contractors, were overwhelmed. The camp was not configured for defense against an internal threat. The assumption built into the design of the camp and into the training of the personnel was that the threat would come from outside the wire, not from inside. That assumption was wrong. Stay with me. What comes next is what reveals the scale of the Iranian penetration. Phase 2 of the operation targeted the forward operating bases and the contractor facilities that support American operations outside of Baghdad. Al Assad Air Base in Anbar Province, which is the largest American military installation in western Iraq, took a ground assault from elements of the 7th Iraqi Army Division and from Popular Mobilization Forces units that were were nominally conducting a joint patrol with American forces. The assault teams used the same tactic. They approached the base under the cover of a joint operation, gained access, and then turned their weapons on the American personnel. Al-Assad's defenses held longer than the defenses at Camp Victory or at the embassy. The base is home to a battalion of U.S. Marines and to Air Force security forces who are trained for base defense. But the assault teams had intelligence on the layout of the base, on the location of key facilities, and on the defensive positions. The fighting lasted for more than 6 hours. The Marines inflicted heavy casualties on the assault teams, but the base's runways, fuel storage, and aircraft parking areas were damaged, and the base's ability to support flight operations was degraded. 11 smaller forward operating bases and diplomatic security outposts scattered across northern and western Iraq took similar assaults. These facilities are manned by small American detachments, typically a platoon or a company, and they depend on Iraqi security forces for perimeter security and for early warning of threats. In every case, the Iraqi security forces either stood down, withdrew, or actively participated in the assaults. The American personnel at these outposts were isolated, outnumbered, and overrun. The casualty rates at the smaller outposts were catastrophic. Early reports suggest that several of the outposts suffered casualty rates exceeding 50%. I want you to understand what that means. The Iranian operation was not a spontaneous uprising. It was not a militia raid. It was a coordinated military operation executed simultaneously across 14 locations by forces that had been pre-positioned, that had been trained, that had been supplied with intelligence, and that had been given a go signal from a central command authority. The level of coordination required to execute such an operation is beyond the capability of independent militia groups. It requires a professional military planning staff, secure communications, and a command hierarchy that can issue orders and enforce operational security across a dispersed network. That capability exists in one organization in Iraq, the IRGC Quds Force. Let me tell you something about the IRGC Quds Force. The Quds Force is the external operations branch of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It is responsible for training, equipping, and directing Iranian proxy forces across the Middle East. The Quds Force operates through a network of liaison officers, training camps, and financial channels that provide support to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Houthis in Yemen, to Shia militias in Syria, and to the popular mobilization forces in Iraq. The Quds Force commander, following the death of Qasem Soleimani in a U.S. drone strike in 2020, is Esmail Ghani. Ghani has spent 4 years rebuilding the networks that were disrupted by Soleimani's death, and the operation on December 14th is the operational proof that those networks are now fully reconstituted and capable of executing complex ground operations. Phase 3 of the Iranian operation was the seizure of American personnel. In the fighting at the embassy, at Camp Victory, and at the smaller outposts, an estimated 180 American military personnel, diplomats, and contractors were captured by the assault teams. The fate of those personnel is unknown. The State Department has not confirmed their status. The IRGC has not publicly acknowledged holding them, but the operational pattern, based on previous Iranian hostage-taking operations, suggests that the captured personnel are being held in secure locations inside Iraq or have been moved across the border into Iran. The psychological and political leverage that Iran gains from holding American hostages is immense. It constrains American military options. It provides Iran with bargaining chips in any negotiation, and it sends a message to American personnel serving in the region that the United States cannot protect them. The Iraqi government's response to the operation has been incoherent and evasive. The initial statement from the Prime Minister's office, released at 11:30 hours on December 14th, condemned the violence and called for calm. The statement did not identify the attackers. It did not acknowledge the role of Iraqi security forces in the assaults, and it did not offer any support to the United States in securing American personnel or in investigating the attacks. Subsequent statements from Iraqi political leaders have blamed the attacks on rogue militia elements acting without government authorization. But the evidence, including video documentation and survivor testimony, makes clear that Iraqi army and federal police units participated directly in the assaults. The reality is that the Iraqi government is not a sovereign actor. It is a contested space in which multiple factions, some aligned with the United States and some aligned with Iran, compete for influence and control. The factions aligned with Iran, which include large elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces, parts of the Iraqi army, and political blocs in the Iraqi parliament, have more effective control over Iraqi security institutions than the factions aligned with the United States. The American assumption, which has guided U.S. policy in Iraq since 2003, is that Iraq is a partner state that shares American interests in stability and in resisting Iranian influence. That assumption is not supported by the facts. Before we go further, you need to understand the cost versus cost arithmetic. The Iranian operation was executed using forces that were already on the Iranian payroll, using weapons that were already in Iraqi inventories, and using intelligence that had been collected over years of patient penetration. The marginal cost to Iran of executing this operation was minimal. The cost to the United States is measured in hundreds of casualties, in the loss of operational bases, in the capture of personnel, and in the strategic humiliation of being unable to defend American compounds in a country where the United States has maintained a military presence for more than 20 years. Phase 4 of the crisis is the American response, or more accurately, the lack of a coherent American response. The immediate priority for U.S. Central Command and for the State Department is the evacuation of American personnel from Iraq. But evacuation under fire is one of the most difficult military operations to execute. It requires secure routes from the compounds to Baghdad International Airport. It requires air superiority to protect the evacuation flights. It requires Iraqi government cooperation to prevent interference from Iraqi security forces and militias. None of those conditions exist. The roads from the Green Zone to the airport are controlled by Iraqi security forces and by Popular Mobilization Forces units that are aligned with Iran. Any American convoy moving along those roads would be vulnerable to ambush. The airspace over Baghdad is contested. Iran-backed militias have demonstrated the capability to shoot down helicopters using shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. And the Iraqi government has not provided any assurances that it will prevent interference with an American evacuation. The State Department cable that was leaked on December 15th acknowledged that a large-scale evacuation is not feasible under current conditions and recommended that American personnel shelter in place inside the secure areas of the embassy compound and the remaining military bases until a negotiated arrangement can be reached with the Iraqi government to allow safe passage. That recommendation is an admission of defeat. It is an acknowledgement that the United States no longer controls the security environment in Iraq and that American personnel are effectively hostages to Iranian goodwill and to the decisions of Iraqi factions that are more loyal to Tehran than to Baghdad. I have said for years in testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and in articles published in foreign policy journals that the American military presence in Iraq is unsustainable. I have argued that the assumption that Iraq is a stable partner state is not supported by the evidence that Iranian influence over Iraqi institutions is pervasive and that the United States is maintaining a military footprint in a country where we do not have the leverage or the the local support necessary to operate effectively. That argument was dismissed. The assumption inside the Pentagon and inside the State Department was that maintaining the presence was strategically necessary to counter Iranian influence and to prevent the reemergence of ISIS. That assumption has now been tested, and it has failed catastrophically. What happened on December 14th is not an isolated attack. It is the culmination of a 15-year Iranian strategy to establish dominant influence in Iraq, to penetrate Iraqi security institutions, and to create the capability to strike American forces at a time and place of Iran's choosing. The strategy has succeeded. The United States is now in a position where it cannot defend its personnel, cannot evacuate them safely, and cannot retaliate effectively without triggering a broader regional conflict that would draw in Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iranian forces operating in Syria. The broader strategic implication of this crisis extends across the Middle East. In Beirut, Hezbollah is watching the American response. If the United States cannot defend its personnel in Iraq, then the implicit message is that the United States cannot defend its interests in Lebanon, in Syria, or in any other theater where Iranian proxies operate. That perception emboldens Hezbollah to pursue more aggressive strategies against Israeli interests and against American allies in the region. In Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, the Gulf states are reassessing the credibility of American security guarantees. The Gulf states have relied on American military power to balance against Iranian influence. The American failure in Iraq suggests that the United States is not a reliable partner and that the Gulf states need to pursue independent security arrangements, either through rapprochement with Iran or through the development of indigenous defense capabilities that do not depend on American support. In Tehran, the success of the operation validates the IRGC's strategy of using proxy forces to challenge American interests without risking direct confrontation. The message that Tehran is sending to Washington is that the United States can maintain a military presence in the region, but it will do so at a cost, and that cost will be measured in casualties, in hostages, and in the erosion of American credibility. For Israel, the implications are immediate and alarming. Israel depends on the assumption that American military power in the region provides a strategic backstop against Iranian aggression. The American failure in Iraq raises the question of whether the United States would be able or willing to defend Israel in the event of a sustained Iranian or Hezbollah attack. That question is likely to accelerate Israeli planning for independent military options, including the potential for unilateral strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. For the broader international community, the message is that the American-led security order in the Middle East is collapsing. The assumption that American military presence deters aggression and provides stability is being tested, and the evidence from Iraq suggests that the assumption is wrong. Hold that thought. I want to come back to a point I made earlier about evacuation. The reason that evacuation is impossible is not just that the routes are contested. It is that the United States does not have the forces in country to secure those routes. The total American military presence in Iraq is approximately 2,500 personnel. Those personnel are dispersed across multiple bases. They do not have the armored vehicles, the air support, or the logistics capacity to conduct a forced evacuation under fire. Bringing in additional forces from outside the theater would take days or weeks, and it would require staging through bases in Kuwait or in the Gulf states, which exposes those forces to Iranian missile and drone strikes during the buildup. The United States is now in a position where it must either accept the loss of the personnel who have been captured, negotiate with the Iraqi government and with Iran for their release, or conduct a high-risk military operation to extract them by force. Each option carries severe costs. Accepting the loss undermines American credibility and morale. Negotiating with Iran provides Tehran with leverage to extract concessions on sanctions on the nuclear program or on other issues, and conducting a military extraction risks heavy casualties and risks triggering a broader conflict that the United States is not prepared to fight. I read every comment on this channel. The question I see most frequently is whether the United States should conduct airstrikes against Iranian targets in retaliation for the operation in Iraq. Let me address that directly. Airstrikes against Iranian targets would provide symbolic satisfaction, but they would not solve the operational problem. The operational problem is that the United States has personnel in Iraq who are surrounded, who are vulnerable, and who cannot be evacuated safely. Conducting airstrikes against Iran does not change that reality. It escalates the conflict. It triggers Iranian retaliation against additional American targets in Iraq, in Syria, in the Gulf states, or potentially against American naval forces in the Persian Gulf. And it does not bring the captured personnel home. The least bad option, which appears to be the option that Washington is pursuing, is to negotiate through intermediaries with the Iraqi government and with Iran for the safe passage of American personnel out of Iraq in exchange for some concession that Iran values. That concession could be a partial lifting of sanctions, a drawdown of American forces from Syria, or a commitment not to interfere with Iranian nuclear activities. Whatever the concession is, it will be costly, and it will set a precedent that every adversary will note. The human cost of this crisis is devastating. The 340 to 410 American personnel killed in the assaults were soldiers, Marines, diplomats, and contractors who were serving in Iraq because their government sent them there. They were told that the mission was important. They were told that the compounds were secure. They were told that the Iraqi security forces were partners, and they were killed by those partners in an operation that their leadership did not anticipate and did not prevent. I want you to understand that every one of those casualties represents a family that will never be whole again, a community that has lost a neighbor, a unit that has lost a teammate. The strategic debates, the policy assessments, the lessons learned, all of that is necessary, but it must not obscure the human cost of this failure. These were not abstractions. These were people, and they were failed by a policy that prioritized the appearance of progress over the operational realities of maintaining a military presence in a country where we do not control the security environment. The question I want to leave you with is this. If Iran can activate sleeper cells inside Iraqi institutions to overrun American compounds, and if the United States cannot evacuate its personnel safely or retaliate effectively, what does that mean for the viability of the American military presence anywhere in the Middle East where Iranian proxies operate? And if the United States withdraws from Iraq under these conditions, what message does that send to allies and adversaries about American resolve and about the credibility of American commitments in contested regions around the world? Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. If this analysis delivered the hard truth about the collapse of American strategy in Iraq, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next update is already in preparation, and what is coming will test every assumption about American power and credibility in the most volatile region on Earth. I will see you in the next.